Hi guys, tonight we're going to be looking at the social upheaval of the 1960s and early 1970s, and the first group that we're going to look at are students. There's a huge rise in the number of colleges in the 1950s and 60s because of the baby boom that occurred just before it. And students are going to be looking for a way to have their voices heard. One of these is through the Students for a Democratic Society, also known as SDS. In the Port Huron Statement, which is their manifesto, they explain their reasons for wanting to fight for more democracy for young people, as well as for an end to certain things like discrimination, as well as the Vietnam War. This group was led largely by Tom Hayden, who you see pictured here. We also have the free speech movement that came through UC Berkeley. They were fighting against the Vietnam War as well. It was not appreciated by the administration, who called in the police to stop their marches and sit-ins, and hundreds of them were arrested. This group was led largely by Mario Savio. These groups were meant to draw attention to the fact that young people did not have a voice, at least politically. And so it wouldn't be until the 24th Amendment is introduced that reduces the voting age to 18 that young people will have an actual political voice. The main group that we're going to look at today is the counterculture, which is exactly what it sounds like. They are counter to the mainstream culture, mainly as a reaction to the conservatism of the 1950s and mainly the conservatism of their own families. But this group is anti-war. They seek to improve social conditions and also wanted to increase equality. The group that you're probably the most familiar with, though, are the hippies. Though not all in the counterculture are hippies, this group is definitely an extreme group. They're kind of on the far end. They have absolute utopian ideals. They believe that there can be a perfect world of peace and harmony. They can be identified not only by the way that they dress, but the music that they listen to, their free love and peace and harmony attitudes, as well as their drug use, which we'll talk more about in just a few minutes. They were first really seen in the Summer of Love in 1967, which occurred in San Francisco, largely within the Haight-Ashbury district. This small, like 4-block area within San Francisco was inundated with over 100,000 hippies because of a music festival that was spurred to kind of foster these ideas of the counterculture. However, not all wanted to live in San Francisco. Some sought to create these utopian societies outside of society by creating communes in which they did live by the ideas of sharing and community and free love, which didn't really jive well with most of mainstream society. Now, as far as the drug culture is concerned, the idea was that drugs were used to expand your mind, to allow you to get to another plane of existence or understanding. The main ones were marijuana and LSD, also known as acid. Now, LSD had been created by the federal government as a mind control method against the Russians. The idea was to drop it in their water supply and for them to hallucinate. However, it didn't work out the way that the government had planned. But a person that was very much in favor of it was Dr. Timothy Leary, who promoted this as a way to get past your own inhibitions, as he used it within psychotherapy, and then later on recommended it for recreational use. His main phrase was to turn in, turn on, and to drop out. The idea was to kind of take the drug, to turn on to an alternative plane, and to drop out of reality. Religion is also a big part of the counterculture, though not the religion that you're expecting. There is a rise and a revival of spirituality and alternative religions. Eastern religions, as well as things like astrology, become very popular. We also have new Christian religions, like the Moonies, that are led by Sun Moon, who believed in creating peace on earth through family and marriage, as well as the Hare Krishna, which were based off of the Indian tradition of Hinduism. And they sang and danced and chanted. The most well-known of the Hare Krishna were actually the Beatles, most specifically George Harrison. But these religious groups a lot of the time had very authoritarian leaders, that they had one single person that was the end-all be-all, which is kind of interesting considering that in all other aspects of their lives, the counterculture people were looking to get rid of authority. Music and art is also a huge part of their culture. Avant-garde, which is art for the sake of art, and pop art, which takes non-art and makes it art by applying art to it. such as the works of Andy Warhol pictured here, where he applied artistic merit to this kind of stock photo of Marilyn Monroe. We also see the rise of psychedelic rock, which is very much associated with the counterculture. It uses experimental sounds and instruments with very trippy lyrics that was meant to be used in association with drug use in order to fully understand it. If you want a good example of this, you can listen to the album The Magical Mystery Tour by the Beatles, and specifically the song I Am the Walrus, and you will understand what I'm talking about. But if we're talking about the music, we got to talk about Woodstock, a 3-day music festival that had over 500,000 people attend. And what was interesting is that although there wasn't enough food or water or shelter, it was absolutely indicative of the counterculture that the people that attended did not end up with fights, did not end up being greedy. They actually worked together and they shared equally amongst everyone that had something to share. And they were there to listen to the biggest bands of the time. They listened to Janis Joplin and to Jimi Hendrix. This would be like going to Coachella today, absolutely for free. It was a pretty incredible experience. But the thing that we will see is that the counterculture declines by the mid-1970s. And the reasons for this are many, but the main reasons are: one, the drug use. Three, the people you see in the background here, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison, all died because of drug overdoses. And people began to be disillusioned with drug use overall. There's also a poor public image because of negative events regarding the counterculture, such as the murders by Charles Manson and his cult family, in order to create a race riot that he called Helter Skelter, as well as the deaths at the Altamont Festival, which was supposed to be the Woodstock of the West, but the Rolling Stones wanted some extra protection and thus had hired the Hells Angels to be security. There were fights and there were a few deaths at this particular festival, and it made the counterculture look really bad. But the main reason why the counterculture disappeared is because they weren't really counter to the mainstream culture anymore. Their ideas of equality and ending the war had become mainstream. So looking at the ideas of equality and civil rights, we're going to look at some of these other civil rights organizations and groups. We know the Warren Court was very much involved in civil rights activism and civil rights decisions. One of the things that is going to become a problem as a result of this, though, is affirmative action. This was created to take race and gender into consideration, into admittance into business as well as education. It was trying to give better opportunities to those that normally were overlooked. The problem being is that some people began to see this as giving people of minorities, of women, and others that were of religious minorities an unfair advantage in business and education, which was the cause behind UC Regents versus Bakke. Alan Bakke not only was a Vietnam veteran, had worked for NASA, but also had scored in the top 3% on the MCAT exams. And yet, he could not get into medical school. And the main reason behind this was because the UC schools had set aside certain quotas to fill for minorities and for women. And although he was more qualified, he had already, they had already filled up their white man positions, and so he was being denied. And the Supreme Court said that this was not fair because it created reverse discrimination, which would later be further supported by Prop 209 here in California, that said that you could not use preferential treatment based on race, gender, ethnicity, etc. in hiring and in education. For Hispanics, we see a rise of activism. As a result of the Bracero program of the 1940s, we have a large number of Hispanic farm workers that have virtually no voice, no power, and no recompense against their employers, which is cause for the rise of the National Farm Workers Association, which will later become the United Farm Workers Union. This was created by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and although this organization is nonviolent, they were tenacious. They did not give up, and their most well-known strike was the Delano grape strike, where it went on for years, where they had a boycott against California grapes because of the mistreatment against the farm workers that actually picked the grapes. The other thing that we're going to see for Hispanics is La Raza Unida, which is the very first political party specifically for Hispanics that was meant to campaign for better housing, better work, and better educational opportunities. One group we haven't talked about in a while are American Indians. Then, as well as now, Native Americans have the most destitute conditions of all minority groups. They are 10 times more likely to be unemployed than any other person in America. And so this was the importance behind the Indian Civil Rights Act. In 1968, the United States officially guaranteed reservation residents the protections of the Bill of Rights. In other words, for the first time in 1968, Native Americans were officially considered U.S. citizens. This is also going to be the rise of the American Indian movement, not only a religious and cultural revival, but also seeking to draw attention to the devastation and destitute conditions of Native Americans. The idea of addressing poverty, housing, and treaty issues for Native Americans. And these broken treaties were a main focus in the occupation of both Wounded Knee, the last location of the Indian Wars of the 1880s and 90s, as well as Alcatraz, which you can still see evidence of on the island today. Now we move on to the LGBT movement, and in 1969, although a very unremarkable thing of police raiding a gay bar occurred, something very remarkable happened in that the patrons began to fight back. And this is the beginning of the gay liberation movement, which is also the very beginning of what became known as the Stonewall riots, a 3-day riot that occurred after police lost control after a raid of a gay bar. The 3-day riot that occurred that sent many to the hospital and many to jail was commemorated 1 year later with the very first Gay Pride Parade, and also the beginning of the Gay Liberation Front, which was meant to encourage people of the LGBT community to come out to their friends and family. Although this was considered illegal in most states, it was meant for them to take back their own identities. This is also the beginning of our introduction to Harvey Milk. He was the first openly gay politician here in California and the most well-known LGBT politician in the world. He helped pass a series of very stringent gay rights laws in San Francisco to protect those of the LGBT community. And although it's hard to believe, at that time, it was actually not a very gay-friendly town. The other thing we see at this time is the beginning of the HIV and AIDS epidemic, which will take hold at the end of the 1970s and go into the 1980s. This is also the beginning of the women's liberation movement and the feminist movement, the idea that women should be socially, politically, and economically equal to men in all ways. Now, although they tried to pass a series of laws to encourage this equality, to make sure that women got equal pay, that they were not discriminated against, and that they had equal opportunities in employment, it did not necessarily have opportunities where these were going to be supported, as well as making sure that they were being enforced. And that is why still today we have the wage gap, where women make only 77 cents to every dollar that a man makes. This is also going to be the beginning of a new organization known as the National Organization for Women, a very outspoken organization that fought for these equal opportunities for women and is still highly active today. We also have the beginning of some national changes with Title IX. This was part of an education act that was making sure that girls got equal opportunities in education to boys. Now, one of the biggest ways that this happened was in sports, because there were no girls' sports prior to Title IX, giving women the opportunity to participate in athletics on an equal playing field, literally. We also have Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade was in which in 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that governments could not regulate abortion during the first 3 months of pregnancy, largely because it went against a woman's constitutional right to privacy. And then we have the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA, although passed by Congress, failed to be ratified by enough states. And the reason being is because women were afraid that it might take away their rights to alimony and divorce, as well as protection against the draft. So the impacts of the women's liberation movement was not only more women in the workforce and education, but our first female Supreme Court justice, as well as the first female to be nominated as a vice presidential candidate. We see that with Geraldine Ferraro in 1984. So that's the end of it for tonight, and I will see you guys tomorrow.